The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a mechanical heartbeat, steady and relentless, as Katie Rodriguez pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor of Seattle General. Norfolk in November meant rain hammered the windows in sheets, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital mixed with something else, the kind of clean desperation that clung to every wall and every person who worked there. 3 months. She'd been at Seattle General for exactly 3 months, and already she knew every orderly by name, every patient's preferred pillow position, every corner where the machines stopped beeping just long enough to hear yourself think. The thing about being a nurse, Katie had learned long ago, was that nobody really saw you. They saw the badge. They saw the scrubs. They saw a body that moved efficiently from room to room, answering call lights and checking vitals and doing the 1,000 small invisible things that kept a hospital breathing. But they didn't see Katie. Not the way they saw Dr. Pierce, who commanded attention the moment his Italian shoes clicked against the tile floor. Not the way they saw the surgeons and cardiologists and department heads whose names appeared in hospital newsletters and whose parking spots were reserved. Katie preferred it that way. She'd always been good at disappearing. 16 years of active service taught you how to move through spaces without leaving marks. How to listen. How to notice what other people missed. How to survive by being the least interesting person in any room. The Navy had called it tactical awareness. The CIA psychologist who debriefed her after the Kandahar assignment called it hypervigilance. Katie just called it paying attention. She restocked the crash cart on 3 East, her hands moving through the familiar choreography, checking the medication drawers, verifying the oxygen tank was full, ensuring the defibrillator pads weren't expired. Her hands were small and scarred, the kind of hands that looked gentle until you knew what they'd actually done. She kept them that way on purpose. Kept everything about herself that way, just competent enough to be useful, invisible enough to be ignored. The trauma alert came through at 0613, just as she was finishing her med rounds. Incoming. 30 minutes. Male, 50s, multiple shrapnel wounds to anterior chest cavity. Kandahar. Coming direct from Ramstein. The ER charge nurse, Marcia, called it out like she was reading the weather report, but Katie felt something shift behind her ribs anyway. Kandahar meant Marine Corps. Kandahar meant the kind of injuries that didn't usually produce people who walked again. Katie updated her charts without saying anything, filed them in the proper slots, and moved to the supply closet. That was her job, to anticipate what would be needed before it was needed. For lines. Pressure dressings. The large bore needles used for massive transfusion protocols. She gathered them quietly, checking labels, confirming sterility, moving with the precision of someone who'd done this exact thing on forward operating bases where the supplies were scarce and the stakes were absolute. She was sorting the last of the crash cart supplies when Dr. Pierce arrived. He moved through the hospital the way wolves move through forests, not especially fast, but with the absolute certainty that everything would yield to his passage. Dr. Marcus Pierce, Chief of Trauma Surgery, 48 years old, educated at Johns Hopkins and Yale and the kind of private schools that cost more per year than most people made. He had the kind of face that looked carved from expectation, sharp cheekbones, pale blue eyes, the faint perpendicular lines between his eyebrows that came from a lifetime of looking down at people. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from never once being told no by anyone who mattered. Katie kept her head down, hands moving, checking items on the crash cart list. Traumatic amputation incoming, Marcia was saying, hurrying to keep pace as Pierce strode toward the ER. Shrapnel injuries, blast mechanism, unknown time in theater. ETA 14 minutes. Pierce didn't slow. Another damaged grunt from Kandahar. Probably vegetative, if we're being honest. Waste of resources, but we'll go through the motions. Get him to trauma 3. Start 2 large bore 4s and, he paused, noticing Katie replacing the last item in the cart. His eyes moved across her like a searchlight scanning a corridor, and then dismissed her just as quickly. Has anyone checked the documentation on these supplies? I've seen sloppy work on inventory before. Nurses, usually. Katie straightened, her hand still steady. All verified, doctor, she said, her voice pitched low and even. "Last checked this morning at 0500. Everything's current." Pierce's gaze returned to her, and this time it stayed. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe, or a predator noticing motion in tall grass. He had the look of someone who'd just discovered something he could use. "And you are?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he didn't really care about her answer. "Katie Rodriguez. Night shift through 0700. "Well, Rodriguez, make sure those supplies actually get used today instead of sitting on a shelf collecting dust. I'd hate to think we're overpaying for." He stopped himself, smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Never mind. Just make sure they're ready." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the tile, and Katie felt Marcia exhale beside her. "He's in a mood," Marcia whispered. "Probably because someone had to call him in early." Katie didn't respond. She was already mentally cataloguing what would be needed, not just for the patient, but for what came after. For the bureaucracy of trauma, the paperwork that followed catastrophe. She'd been a nurse for 3 years at Seattle General, but she'd been managing crisis logistics for considerably longer than that. The Black Hawk touched down at Bethesda Naval Medical Center at 0627, though Katie wouldn't know that for several more hours. The patient, a Marine general named Kirkland, arrived at Seattle General by helicopter transfer at 0644, and the whole hospital seemed to hold its breath as they wheeled him through the ER doors. Katie watched from her position at the nurse's station, watching the way the medics moved, the careful precision of their transfers, the controlled urgency that came from transporting someone whose chest was essentially a map of shrapnel and blood loss. Kirkland's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old milk. Katie counted the chest wounds automatically, training, muscle memory, the thing her body did without asking permission from her mind. 5 entry points. 3 of them deep. 1 proximity to the cardiac silhouette that made her inhale sharply through her nose. That was when she heard Dr. Pierce again, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos like a scalpel. "Get him stabilized, but don't waste intensive resources on someone this far gone," Pierce said to the trauma attending. "We need those beds. This is a career ender, and everyone knows it. Just keep him comfortable, Anne." "Doctor." The trauma attending interrupted, her voice low but firm. "He's a general. Marine Corps. He doesn't deserve that conversation in open air." Pierce's jaw tightened. He didn't like being corrected. Katie recognized that look immediately, the small spike of rage that someone like Pierce felt when his authority was questioned. He stood there for 1 long second, and then nodded curtly and turned away, his eyes finding Katie across the crowded ER, looking at her in a way that felt like marking territory. She looked back down at her work and didn't let him see her face. The rain outside drummed against the windows like mortar fire, and Katie moved through the ER with the efficiency of someone who'd trained for situations like this. She checked the placement of the central line. Verified the medication drip rates. Ensured the blood products were being infused at the right pressure. Small invisible work. Vital work. The kind of work that nobody credited because it was supposed to happen naturally, like breathing. But what Katie understood, standing over the Marine General's ICU bed hours later as the evening shift took over, was that some people could see. Some people could recognize the difference between someone who was just following protocol and someone who understood every single variable, every escalation point, every moment where the machine could still be saved. She didn't know yet that one of those people was lying in this bed. She didn't know yet that her real mission, the reason the Navy had placed her here at Seattle General 3 months ago, the reason her nursing license was real but her background was sanitized, the reason she moved through Norfolk with a cover identity so seamless that even she sometimes forgot it was a cover, was about to collide with her cover life in ways neither the Navy nor Dr. Pierce could have predicted. The patch sewn inside her jacket lining, faded, worn, the emblem barely visible, remained hidden against her ribs. 16 years it had been there. 16 years since she'd worn it openly. That was about to change. But not yet. Not tonight. For now, there was only the rain on the windows, the hum of monitors, and Dr. Pierce's footsteps echoing through the hallway as he moved toward the trauma bay, already planning his next move, already certain that nobody at Seattle General possessed the kind of competence that could threaten his absolute control. Katie kept her head down and continued her work, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done much harder things than this in much harder places than Norfolk. The hardest part, she'd learned long ago, was always the waiting. Katie's hands moved through the chart review with mechanical efficiency, each page turned with the precision of someone counting rounds. 3 months at Seattle General in Norfolk had taught her the rhythm of the trauma bay, the particular way fluorescent light caught on stainless steel, the exact pressure needed to silence a ventilator alarm before it woke the entire floor. She'd learned to exist in the margins, the kind of nurse other staff didn't quite see. Invisible was safer. Invisible meant no one asked questions. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor at 0613 hours, and Dr. Pierce stepped out carrying a fresh coffee and the particular swagger of a man whose last name matched his inherited trust fund. He was reviewing cases for morning rounds, his voice already pitched loud enough for the hallway to hear. Katie kept her distance, tucking herself into the medication room with its humming refrigerators and the sharp sting of antiseptic. Rodriguez. He found her anyway. He always did. You're assisting in grand rounds today. We need a demonstration of proper protocol. She looked up from the 4 bags. Yes, doctor. The grand rounds amphitheater filled at 0700 with residents, attending physicians, nursing students, the full hierarchy of the hospital arranged in descending rows of ego. Katie stood near the crash cart in scrubs that had seen better days, her badge clipped precisely at chest level, her hands folded the way the army had taught her, composed, available, ready. She'd briefed generals. She'd stood in rooms where men decided whether other men lived or died. A hospital teaching presentation was barely a ripple. Pierce began with a case study, a patient with a simple wound infection, nothing dramatic. He invited Katie forward. She approached, knowing exactly what was coming. Show them your sterile field technique, he said, his tone already carrying the knife edge of a setup. She began with textbook precision. Hand hygiene. Proper workspace. The careful choreography she'd performed 10,000 times. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of field medicine, steady, efficient, economical. Pierce stepped closer. Notice how Nurse Rodriguez here has developed her own creative interpretation of sterile protocol. He smiled at the residents like he'd caught a child coloring outside the lines. Notice the spacing of her instruments, unusual. Notice how she positions the drape, not quite regulation. Very creative. His voice dripped with the kind of mockery that doesn't quite cross into outright cruelty but leaves you feeling like you've been publicly undressed. Several residents laughed. A senior attending smirked. Katie's hands didn't pause. Measured breath. She tucked the reaction somewhere safe, the way you pack a weapon you'll need later. The irony burned quietly. Her technique came from 17 months in Kandahar, from learning to maintain a sterile field in a dusty aid station where one contamination meant amputation, where every movement had cost lives if done wrong. Her hands were moving textbook perfect medicine. He was mocking precision he didn't recognize. She finished the demonstration. No reaction. Not even a blink. Pierce's frustration flickered across his face, that micro-expression of a bully encountering someone who won't perform pain. By 11:22 hours, Katie was at the staff vending machine watching a bag of pretzels tumble down the mechanical chute. Behind her, Pierce stood with 2 surgical residents, their voices carrying that particular male-bonding tone of shared contempt. She took her time extracting the bag. Never understand why they bother applying to medical school, Pierce was saying, his volume calibrated for her to hear. The ego on these nurses. They watch one surgery, suddenly they're diagnosing. Rodriguez actually stood there 2 days ago and questioned my medication order. A nurse questioned my order. He laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed off the vending machine's metal frame. I said, Rodriguez, you want a stethoscope? I can write you a prescription for your delusions of grandeur. Might help you sleep better than fantasies about being a doctor. The residents laughed on cue. Katie opened the pretzel bag without turning around. The mechanical sound of the bag tearing was the only reply she offered. She walked past Pierce and the residents with her shoulders perfectly level, her expression perfectly neutral. Inside, something crystalline and dangerous was forming. But he would never see it. By 16:03 hours, Dr. Pierce had progressed to the next stage. Katie was writing orders in the general's chart, her patient now, the Marine from Kandahar with shrapnel wounds that had come perilously close to ending him. The monitors showed his pain levels climbing again. His breathing had started to shallow, that particular pattern Katie recognized as someone fighting against the burning in his chest cavity. She approached Pierce outside the room. His pain medication is wearing off. He needs the next dose increased. Pierce was reviewing labs, not looking at her. No. Reduce it. His vitals. I said reduce it. Now he looked at her, and his eyes held the particular coldness of a man discovering he had the power to deny something she needed. You're a nurse, Rodriguez. You see a number on the monitor. I see a patient. Sometimes comfort medication creates a false sense of security that prevents them from pushing themselves toward recovery. I want him alert enough to feel the healing process. Katie felt something shift. Not in her, but in the room itself, the air pressure changing, the way it did before a temperature differential became visible. She'd heard theories like his before. She'd watched men die while proving theories like his. That's not standard practice, she said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Quiet. Almost conversational. The literature shows. The literature, he cut her off, was written by people who believe every patient is a victim. I believe in accountability through pain. He smiled at her like he'd just said something wise. Besides, if you have a problem with my medical judgment, I can have security escort you from the building. You're replaceable. You understand? Just a nurse. The words landed exactly where he'd aimed them. But Katie had absorbed worse. She'd held dying men in her arms. She'd made decisions that cost lives whether she made them or didn't. This man's contempt was a minor weather system, easily navigated. The crowded hallway outside the general's room filled with the afternoon shift change, staff moving between units, conversations overlapping. Katie stood with her hands in her pockets, trying to track why her chest felt like an open wound. Then she saw Pierce approaching from the opposite direction, and she made a choice. She stepped directly into his path. His eyes registered surprise. No one usually did this. Your insecurity is showing, doctor, she said, her voice so calm it sounded like she was observing the weather. And it's unbecoming. She held his gaze while one tear, exactly one, hot and perfect, escaped from her left eye. She wiped it away without looking down, without breaking eye contact, without giving him the satisfaction of watching her compose dissolve. Around them, the hallway traffic seemed to pause. Someone had heard. Several someones. Pierce's face went through three colors. Red. White. A purple-tinged fury. But he had no response that wouldn't make him look worse. He pivoted and walked away, his shoulders tight with the rage of a man used to being the scariest thing in every room and discovering he wasn't. That was when the emergency alarm started. The patient in Bay 3 wasn't supposed to code until 0300. But trauma doesn't consult a schedule. The Marine General's monitors went electric with chaos, his heart rate spiking to 138, blood pressure dropping like someone had pulled a plug, oxygen saturation beginning its fatal descent toward the bottom. Katie heard the alarm and was already moving before her conscious mind processed the sound. Her feet knew the way. Her hands had already started remembering. The code team assembled with the speed of practiced chaos. Dr. Pierce arrived second, breathing hard like he'd run, his face flushed with the particular cocktail of adrenaline and ego that made surgeons dangerous in crisis. The general was unconscious, his chest heaving, the surgical repairs from Kandahar screaming their inadequacy through every alarming vital sign. Pneumothorax, Katie said quietly, reading the clinical picture the way you read a map. Collapsed lung. Tension building. The kind of killer you had maybe 3 minutes to fix. Pierce was already reaching for a 14-gauge needle. Katie watched his hands and saw the error forming, too far forward, wrong intercostal space, the angle off by maybe 5 degrees. 5 degrees was everything. 5 degrees was the difference between releasing pressure and puncturing the lung further. Second intercostal, she said. Not a question. Not a request. A coordinate. Pierce didn't look at her. I don't need commentary from the nursing staff. His needle went in. The lung didn't decompress. The patient's oxygen sat fell harder, 87, 82, 78. The monitors sang the song of imminent death. The corpsman from the ER, Petty Officer Callahan from the 2nd Battalion, Dark Horse Company, had been restocking supplies in the corner. He'd been standing there when Katie moved forward to take over compressions, when her hands found their position on the general's sternum with a precision that transcended muscle memory and entered the territory of pure reflex. She knew exactly where the ribs would fracture safely. She knew exactly how much force meant salvation versus additional trauma. Callahan's head snapped up. He stared at her hands moving through the sequence, the specific 3-point pressure pattern used in field amputations outside Helm and Province, pressure applied in a way that maximized blood flow while preventing secondary tissue damage. The technique wasn't in any American nursing textbook. It only existed in one place, the combat medical training given to combat medics who'd spent 18 months keeping Marines alive in places where hospitals were 50 kilometers away and death was measured in minutes. His eyes went wide. He looked at her face, really looked at it, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. The kind that came from sharing a particular kind of hell with someone. Katie didn't acknowledge him. Her focus was entirely on the general's chest, on the light percussion that told her where the second attempt at decompression needed to go, on the steady count of compressions that sounded like a timer ticking down to either resurrection or failure. But she felt Callahan's recognition like a mark being left on her shoulder. 30 seconds into the new rhythm, the general's oxygen saturation began climbing. 79, 83. 87, the second needle worked. The pressure released. His lungs began accepting air again. Pierce stood frozen, watching a nurse he'd spent 3 days methodically humiliating somehow prevent his patient from dying through means he didn't understand and couldn't replicate. The monitors began their death song at 0306 on a Tuesday. 3 beeps. Then flat line. Then the sound of everything stopping. Katie stood at the medication cart on the 3rd floor when the overhead crackled. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 2. General Morrison. Her hands moved before her mind caught up, already knowing which bay, already moving through the corridors at a pace that looked unhurried but covered ground like water finding downhill. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she ran, casting shadows that made the hallway feel like it was breathing. Morrison had been stable for hours ago. Fever climbing. O2 sat 91%. She'd checked his dressing herself at 2,200, the surgical site holding, no new bleeding, no sign of compromise. The ventilator had been weaning smoothly. Protocol said he was improving. Protocol had been wrong before. When she pushed through the trauma bay doors, Dr. Pierce was already there, hands moving but fingers shaking. His trauma shears hung from his neck like a talisman that had failed him. The general lay grey-blue beneath the overhead lights, his chest heaving with the ventilator's rhythm but the rhythm itself becoming ragged. His right lung had collapsed again. A secondary pneumothorax developing in the field he'd already repaired once. Call respiratory, Pierce snapped. Get me a chest tube kit. 14 gauge. Katie moved past him to the head of the bed. She could see it immediately, the way Morrison's neck veins were distending, the way his pupils were blown, the way his body was screaming that his lungs had betrayed him again. Not bleeding. Air-trapped. Pressure building. The same physics that had crushed men in Kandahar were crushing him here in a room with $600,000 worth of equipment. Lines kinked, she said quietly, reaching for the ventilator tubing. I'm aware, Nurse Rodriguez. I didn't ask for. She straightened the line. The pressure reading on the monitor dropped. His oxygen saturation began its slow climb. 68. 70. But it wasn't enough. The secondary collapse was worsening, pressure building in his thoracic cavity, pushing against his heart. He was in tension pneumothorax. Without decompression, he'd arrest in under 4 minutes. ETA on respiratory. Pierce demanded. 12 minutes, someone called from the corner. They're in another code. 12 minutes. Morrison had 4. The math was simple and absolute. Katie's hands moved to the emergency equipment. The crash cart. The scalpel. The 14-gauge needle for needle decompression, but she could see already that it wouldn't hold long enough. The air was building too fast. The pressure was too great. Needle decompression was the stopgap, the bridge. But Morrison needed surgery. Morrison needed a thoracotomy. I'm calling the attending surgeon, Pierce said. Get me Dr. Harland on the phone. No answer, someone said. He's not responding to Page. Try again. Try his cell. Katie was already opening the equipment, hands moving on their own now. The muscle memory was there, underneath 3 years of scrubs and bedside manners, underneath the careful camouflage. Underneath the naval intelligence briefing that had sent her to Seattle General to watch this patient specifically. Underneath everything. Nurse Rodriguez, Pierce said sharply. Step back from. She didn't answer. Didn't acknowledge him. Her voice had changed. Everyone in the room heard it shift from deferential to flat authority. Scalpel. Size for endotracheal tube. Epinephrine 1 milligram. Sterile field. Now. The room responded. Her tone had the weight of command, and even though she wore a nurse's badge, everyone in that room understood they were taking orders from someone accustomed to being obeyed. Petty Officer Callahan, the corpsman they'd brought up from the ICU to help with Morrison's care, recognized it immediately. His eyes widened. He'd seen hands move like this before. He'd seen this precision in a desert outside Helmand Province when a captain had pulled 3 men from burning wreckage with the calm of someone who had already made peace with death. Dr. Pierce, Katie said, and her voice was the temperature of a surgical suite, step back. He stepped back. He didn't mean to. His feet simply obeyed what his brain hadn't processed yet. Katie's hands moved through the anatomy with the certainty of someone who had done this in sandstorms and gunfire and darkness. The 5th intercostal space. Mid-axillary line. The scalpel opened the skin cleanly, a vertical incision through dermis and subcutaneous tissue and into the pleural space. The rush of pressurized air was nearly audible, the hiss of weeks of accumulation escaping. Blood and fluid. The lung collapsed further, and for one terrible moment the general's O2 saturation dropped to 52. But then Katie was inside, her fingers finding the rib cage, spreading the intercostal muscles apart, opening the thoracic cavity like a book. The lung was there, compressed and useless, but the heart was still beating. Still fighting. She positioned the endotracheal tube, the largest one that would fit, threading it into the right mainstem bronchus with the kind of precision that only came from having your muscle memory trained in places that required it. Epinephrine. 1 milligram for push. The general's heart rate climbed from 43 to 68 to 86. His O2 saturation began its steady climb. 72. 78. 85. 90. 92. The numbers accumulating like a prayer answered. Vital stabilizing, someone whispered. Katie's hands kept moving. Dressing the wound. Securing the tube. Double-checking the airway. Everything clean. Everything precise. Everything held together by someone who had done this before in conditions infinitely worse. The ventilator caught the rhythm she'd created and took over, breathing for Morrison now, keeping him stable. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, heavy drops against the windows like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. Get Dr. Harland back on the phone, Katie said, and her voice was giving orders now, not asking permission. I need a cardiothoracic surgeon from Bethesda on video consult in the next 30 minutes. Morrison's primary repair is stable, but he's going to need evaluation for ECMO if we get any more deterioration. And I need someone to draw labs, CBC, CMP, lactate, coagulation panel. Now. People moved. People who had never taken an order from her before. People who had seen her as just a nurse 1 minute ago suddenly understood that somewhere underneath the scrubs and the quiet competence was someone accustomed to command. Petty Officer Callahan stood frozen, staring at her hands. Those hands. He'd seen identical hands pulling a Marine sergeant from burning metal outside Sanjan Valley. He'd watched those hands move through trauma with the calm that only came from having your training written into your DNA by years of active deployment. And there was something else, a small mark on her left wrist, barely visible beneath the sterile glove's edge. A tattoo. The kind you only got if you'd survived something that killed better people than you. Dr. Pierce was pale. His mouth was opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. He'd tried to order her around for 3 days, and in the space of 4 minutes she'd taken over his trauma bay and performed a surgical procedure with the kind of mastery that his medical degree had never granted him. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made his face go absolutely white. It was when Morrison's eyes fluttered open, just barely, just enough to focus, and he looked directly at Katie. His voice was barely a whisper, cracked and broken and desperate. But he got the words out. "Iron Angel," he breathed. "Your Iron Angel." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside turning into a downpour. The words hung there between them like a confession, like a secret that had been traveling toward this moment for months. Katie's hand stilled for exactly 2 seconds. Then she finished checking the ventilator settings with the same measured precision she'd been using all along. "Rest now," she said quietly. "I've got you." But Petty Officer Callahan had heard it. He'd heard the call sign. He'd heard the name that soldiers in Kandahar whispered like a prayer in darkness. And now he understood exactly who he'd been working alongside for 3 years while she pushed medications and changed dressings and let Dr. Pierce humiliate her in public like she was nobody important. What happened next would change everything. But first, Katie had 24 hours to keep the general breathing. 24 hours before the specialists arrived. 24 hours before anyone could ask questions. She pulled up a chair and sat down beside Morrison's bed, her eyes on the monitors, her hand steady as the ventilator's rhythm. The vigil had begun. Dawn broke grey over Norfolk, and Dr. Pierce's shoes clicked across the tile floor of the trauma ward at 6:33 a.m. He stopped at Morrison's room. Katie was still there. Still sitting in the same chair, her hand on the general's wrist, monitoring the pulse beneath her fingertips like it was the only vital sign that mattered. 24 hours of vigil. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. O2 sat 96. Heart rate stable. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath, synchronized to Morrison's own. She hadn't moved. Her scrubs were wrinkled, damp at the collar from sweat and exhaustion. A coffee cup, empty since midnight, sat on the bedside table beside a stack of medical charts Katie had annotated in her precise handwriting. Pierce's smile arrived before his words. Reptilian. The kind of smile that announced he'd been waiting for this moment. Well. Still here, Nurse Rodriguez. He didn't wait for an answer. He was already pulling out his phone, his thumbs moving across the screen with the methodical precision of someone building a case. An email to hospital administration. Carbon copied to the nursing board. Another one. Then another. Each keystroke a small brick in a wall he'd construct brick by brick by brick until Katie couldn't stand upright inside it anymore. Katie didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Morrison's chest, watching it rise and fall. Rise and fall. The ventilator maintaining the rhythm she'd fought 24 hours to establish. Her fingers remained steady on the general's wrist. One measured breath. That's all she allowed herself. You understand you violated scope of practice, Pierce said, his voice carrying the weight of someone quoting scripture. Section 7, subsection C of the 1987 Nursing Standards Regulatory Framework. I have documentation. He gestured to his phone like it was Exhibit A in a prosecution. Grand Rounds observation. Incident report filed at 4:13 this morning by trauma nurse Jenkins, though I helped her understand what she actually witnessed. I've already contacted the state licensing board. 3 emails. With photographs. Katie closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. She opened them again. Her voice, when it came, was level as a surgical plane. He would have died without the procedure. The specialists arrived because he was stable. That's precisely the problem, Pierce said, and he was smiling wider now, his teeth showing. You didn't stabilize him. You performed surgery. A surgery. With a blade from the crash cart. On a Marine general. A man whose family will sue this hospital into bankruptcy the moment they understand what an unlicensed surgical technician did to their father. He leaned against the door frame like he had all the time in the world. You gave me everything I needed. Everything. The hospital was waking up around them. Shift change bells rang. Nurses moved through corridors. Breakfast trays rattled on carts. The world continued its ordinary rhythm while Pierce built his documentary case with the patience of a man who'd finally found permission to destroy something he despised. By 11:53 a.m., Katie's credentials were flagged in the hospital system. Not suspended. Not under review. Flagged. Which meant she couldn't access patient records. Couldn't administer medications. Couldn't touch a monitor without someone reporting it. The email came from Human Resources. Professional and cold. Pending investigation into scope of practice violations, your access has been temporarily restricted. By 1:48 p.m., they called her into the nursing director's office. A woman named Charlene who'd always seemed competent until she looked at Katie with the eyes of someone who'd already decided. I'm going to need your badge and your access card. Katie didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that fighting bureaucracy was like fighting fog, your hands passed through it but nothing changed. She pulled the lanyard from her neck. The badge clattered against the tile floor. She picked it up and placed it on Charlene's desk. My locker. Already been cleared. Security was very thorough. Boxes waiting in the break room. The cardboard box sat on the folding table like a coffin for the life she'd built here. Katie picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. Everything you are, reduced to what fits in your arms. A cracked mug that read World's Okayest Nurse in fading letters. A dying succulent, brown at the edges, that Morrison had given her 3 weeks ago when he could still speak. A photograph of her unit in Kandahar, Charlie Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. 22 faces in desert camouflage. Someone had drawn XS through half of them. Black marker. A ritual they all knew. The ones who'd come home and the ones who hadn't. The rain started at 2:06 p.m. Katie sat on a bus stop bench on East Main, 3 blocks from the hospital. The rain fell in sheets, the kind that hammered the pavement like applause from an invisible crowd. Her uniform was soaked through. The cardboard box disintegrated in her lap, the bottom going soft, the mug rolling onto the wet concrete. She let it roll. What did it matter now? The succulent fell into a puddle. She picked it up. Held it. The water dripped through her fingers. Her phone had gone silent at noon. No calls. No texts. The Naval Intelligence contact number, the one she'd memorized 17 years ago and never written down, suddenly felt like a fantasy she'd invented. A story she'd told herself. She had $247 in her wallet. A credit card that tied directly to her false identity, which was about to be burned out by hospital security checking her background. A lie that was collapsing in real time. She could call. The number was still in her head. Somewhere in the Pentagon, someone in a dark room was monitoring her secure phone. They'd know by now. The hospital records. The regulatory flags. The quiet deletion of Captain Catherine Marie Rodriguez from every classified database connected to naval intelligence operations. But she couldn't call. Not yet. The mission in the hospital, the one that had brought her here 6 months ago, the investigation into the smuggling ring funneling medications to black market distributors, the supplier inside the pharmacy, the one they were still trying to identify, the mission would die the moment she blew her cover. 6 months of surveillance. 17 pharmacy staff flagged. A federal investigation that depended entirely on Katie being invisible. She held the unit photograph in the rain. The water beaded on the plastic coating. The faces of dead Marines stared back at her. Williams. Chen. Rojas. Sanchez. 4 of the crossed-out names. 4 of the 6. She'd held William's hand while he bled out outside Marja. She'd called Chen's mother herself, 3 days after the funeral, just to hear someone say his name out loud. She'd carried this photo for 9 years. Through jump schools and combat medic training and 3 tours and an undercover assignment that had turned into the longest war of all, the quiet kind, where your enemy was boredom and bureaucracy and the slow recognition that you'd been running so long you'd forgotten what it meant to stop. She almost threw the photo away. Her hand went to the edge of the trash bin. The rain drummed on the metal. One flick of her wrist and it would be gone. Catherine Rodriguez would disappear into the landfill with the coffee cups and the parking receipts and all the other things people threw away without thinking. But she didn't flick her wrist. Instead, her hand moved to her jacket pocket. Inside, sewn into the lining with black thread, was the faded unit patch from Charlie Platoon. 3rd Battalion. The patch she'd had on her uniform when she'd pulled the first 6 Marines out of the burning APC outside Kandahar city. The patch that had been there for every combat mission. It had survived 3 deployments. 6 surgeries. 17 years. She ran her thumb across the stitching. The fabric was rough now, coming loose at the edges. But the call sign was still legible in white embroidery. Iron Angel. That's what they'd called her. Not Catherine. Not Rodriguez. Iron Angel. The one who didn't break. The one who kept pulling bodies out of fire until there was nothing left to pull. And then she heard it. Distant at first. A low thrumming sound that cut through the rain. Getting closer. The kind of sound that made the base of her skull tighten with recognition. She didn't look up. She knew what it was. She'd been waiting for this sound for 6 months, and now that it was here, she didn't know if she was relieved or terrified. The rain kept falling. The sound got louder. And Katie Rodriguez sat on a bus bench in Norfolk, Virginia, holding a dying plant and the photograph of dead Marines, while the world she'd hidden from began to arrive. The rotor wash hit the parking lot at 3:08 a.m., shaking rain sideways across the asphalt like God was wringing out a wet towel. Katie heard it first, that signature thud-thud-thud of military helicopters that made her spine remember things her brain wanted to forget. She didn't move from the bus bench. The cardboard box sat on her lap. Inside it, a cracked mug that read World's Okayest Nurse, a succulent browning at the edges, and a photograph of her unit in Kandahar with half the faces marked through in black ink. The helicopter circled once. Then descended toward Seattle General, 3 blocks away. She knew what that meant. Naval intelligence operated on specific timelines, and she'd just compressed hers into a catastrophe. The undercover nurse was finished. The mission was compromised. The smuggling investigation she'd been building for 6 months, gone. All because Dr. Pierce had needed a target to break, and she'd been convenient. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Unknown number. She let it ring. Inside the hospital, the director of surgical services was staring at a classified security clearance that had just appeared in a routine background check for the malpractice lawsuit. His name was Dr. Harold Vance, 54 years old, 32 years of military service before he'd taken the civilian job. He knew immediately what that symbol meant. He picked up the red phone, the one that connected directly to Bethesda Naval Medical Center, and waited for the voice of Commander Thomas Webb to confirm what he already understood. "Captain Rodriguez is active duty," Webb said. His voice carried the weight of someone used to saying things that changed careers. "She was embedded at your facility as part of a narcotics trafficking investigation. She stays in role until the case is closed or compromised. As of 45 minutes ago, she's compromised. The helicopter en route is extraction. I need her prepped for immediate departure." "And Dr. Vance? Whatever happened at your hospital that forced her hand, we need details. Everything. Now." Vance hung up and walked directly to the trauma bay. General Morrison was sleeping, his chest wrapped in fresh bandages, his vitals stable for the first time in 72 hours. The man owed his life to a nurse he'd known for 3 months. The man had no idea. Dr. Pierce arrived at the hospital at 12 a.m. because he always arrived early. The hospital was his kingdom before anyone else woke up to challenge his reign. He'd spent the night reviewing the incident reports, crafting the final documentation that would seal Katie Rodriguez's termination. Scope of practice violation. Unauthorized surgical intervention. Reckless endangerment. By tomorrow, she'd be unemployable. He walked into Morrison's room to confirm the general was still alive, still sedated, still a liability waiting to happen. The general's eyes opened. They weren't the clouded, medicated eyes of a trauma patient. They were sharp. Alert. Waiting. "Iron Angel," Morrison whispered. The words hit Pierce like a physical force. He froze in the doorway. A corpsman standing bedside, Petty Officer Callahan from the extraction team, already inside the hospital, didn't move. But his hand went very still on the fall line. Pierce's face drained of color. "What did you just—" "Get out," Morrison said. His voice was barely audible, but it moved like a command through concrete. "Now." The door opened. A Marine colonel in dress blues filled the frame. His uniform carried medals Pierce couldn't identify because they didn't belong to the medical world. The colonel was holding a leather folder. He didn't ask permission. He opened it and began reading aloud. "Captain Katie Rodriguez, for conspicuous gallantry under fire, Kandahar Province, when hostile forces engaged her forward operating base with sustained small arms fire and mortar rounds. Despite direct fire, Captain Rodriguez provided medical care to 14 wounded Marines, 3 of whom would have bled out without her intervention. She performed emergency procedures under combat conditions that saved lives and prevented further casualties. For her heroism under fire, the United States Marine Corps presents her with the Silver Star." The colonel lowered the folder. "That was 2013, Dr. Pierce. There are 2 Purple Hearts in this file. And a Navy Cross." He looked directly at the surgeon. "Do you understand what you've been speaking to?" Pierce tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing emerged. General Morrison raised a trembling hand, the same hand that had been paralyzed 8 hours ago, and rendered a salute. The movement cost him everything, but he did it. His eyes fixed on the bedside table where someone had laid out Katie's decorations. A silver star. 2 Purple Hearts. And beneath them, barely visible because it had been sewn inside her jacket lining for 3 years, the faded unit patch of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Iron Angel. She'd kept it hidden the entire time she was undercover. A single piece of her real self, close enough to her heart to remember who she was supposed to be. Pierce backed out of the room. He didn't run. He walked. But his hands were shaking, and his face had turned the color of old bone. He headed for the break room. He had 36 hours before the hospital board would convene, and he needed to move quickly. An NDA could still protect him. A careful story could still work. A sealed settlement could make this disappear. People disappeared every day if you had the right connections. What he didn't account for was Petty Officer Callahan's phone. The corpsman had recorded the entire vending machine mockery from 2 weeks ago, Pierce's voice, loud and cruel, imitating Katie's procedures, his laughter bouncing off the walls of the empty break room like the sound of someone who'd never had to earn anything in his life. The video went out at 6:22 a.m. It went to the hospital administrator, the nursing board, and to a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been Pierce's medical school mentor for 4 years and his surgeon supervisor for 1 year before she'd left his residency program because she couldn't watch him destroy talented people anymore. Dr. Chen watched the video for 37 seconds. Then she released a public statement that reached the local news by 7:15 a.m. I trained this surgeon. I believed in his potential. I was wrong. His cruelty is not a personality flaw, it's a choice. It reflects a character so fundamentally damaged that he has no business holding a scalpel or holding power over anyone. I am requesting that the Maryland Board of Physicians conduct an immediate review of his credentials and his record at this facility. I am requesting that the hospital implement independent oversight of all his surgical decisions. And I am requesting that anyone who has been harmed by this surgeon's conduct come forward. He will face consequences. I will ensure it. By 8:56 a.m., the medical board had filed for emergency review. By 3:51 p.m., his privileges had been suspended. By 5:19 p.m., the hospital director had received the termination paperwork from legal. Dr. Pierce was finished. He just didn't know the scope of it yet. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez visited a community college in Tucson, Arizona, to update her emergency medical certifications. She wasn't there as an undercover operative. She was there as a woman who'd been cleared for her next assignment. The smuggling investigation had concluded. The perpetrators had been arrested. The hospital had begun its own reforms. She walked past the continuing education wing, past the CPR training room, and froze. Dr. Pierce stood over a plastic dummy, demonstrating chest compressions. His name tag read, Steve. His hand shook as he pressed down. 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 The board students barely watched. He was making $18 an hour, teaching the same CPR protocol he'd once wielded as a status symbol, now just another minimum wage certification course that no one paid attention to. Katie didn't stop. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge him. She simply placed her captain's bars on the edge of the dummy's chest as she passed. 2 small brass insignia that represented everything he'd spent his career destroying in other people. She left them there and kept walking. When she stepped outside into the Tucson sunshine at 2:13 p.m., he was waiting. General Morrison, walking with a cane but walking, his breathing clear and strong. He held 2 cups of coffee and something else, the genuine smile of a man who'd been given back his life. He'd been cleared for discharge weeks ago. He'd flown to Arizona on his own to find her. Captain Rodriguez, he said. It was the first time he'd used her real rank outside a classified briefing. I believe you owe me a conversation. She took the coffee. She didn't smile, that wasn't her style, but something in her expression softened. Something that had been locked away since the bus bench in Norfolk, since the cardboard box, since the moment she'd understood that saving his life meant losing hers. 20 minutes, she said. Then I have a helicopter waiting. I can work with 20 minutes, Morrison replied. They sat on a bench facing the hospital where he'd been reborn. The rain from Norfolk felt like another lifetime. The rain in Tucson was softer, warmer, the kind that fell on people who'd already paid their debts. She didn't tell him about the years ahead, the assignments already waiting, the next hospital, the next invisible war. She didn't need to. He understood. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the specific discipline of someone who'd learned to hold everything vital inside and release nothing until the moment demanded it. Scars tell stories. The ones etched on Morrison's chest were Katie's signature. The ones you couldn't see, the ones she carried in the spaces between her ribs and her bones, those belonged to everyone who'd ever been underestimated and survived it. Back at Seattle General, they'd renamed the trauma wing. The Admiral Catherine Rodriguez Memorial Trauma Center opened 6 weeks after she'd left. It specialized in combat wound treatment and veteran care, pro bono, unlimited. The hospital had learned what it cost to ignore someone's real capacity. The lesson was expensive, but it stuck. And Katie Rodriguez, wherever she was, whatever uniform she was hiding beneath scrubs, whatever battle no one would ever know about, she was still saving lives. Still the quiet one. Still the most dangerous person in the room. The ones who've seen the worst are often the ones who give the most. If someone you trusted completely suddenly revealed a hidden life, would you feel betrayed or grateful? If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.